Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Noire for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3. This is what I would consider an action-adventure game. It was developed by Team Bondi and published by Rockstar Games in 2011, first for Xbox and PlayStation, then later on in the year in November for PC. Now that's something interesting to note. There was the release in May for console and then the release in November for PC. And the PC version was, on release, absolutely horrendous. It was pretty much unplayable, and even on my end, I got it post-patches, and I still couldn't run it. In fact, the first time I tried to play this thing, it wouldn't even start up. I had no idea why. Nobody could ever give me a fix for it, so I don't know what was going on there. But this thing just wouldn't run. When I finally got Windows 7 installed on my system, it suddenly worked. But it didn't work well. There's still massive problems with the PC port, so unless you have a really beefy PC, I cannot recommend the PC version of this game. Because you'll probably be like me and run into the very unfortunate circumstance of it just not running well. And it doesn't run that great on consoles either. That's something to keep in mind. The game was just notorious for being buggy and somewhat unfinished. It felt like it was kind of rushed. And people noted this. But in general, it was seen as this kind of technological leap forward, as well as this very interesting game that Rockstar had never really done before. But is that enough to really make it rise above everything else that Rockstar has done and actually make it worth getting? Well, they did put an absolutely massive amount of effort into the presentation of this game, and so you have to talk quite a bit about that, because a lot of it actually pertains to the gameplay. The first thing they did was they really captured the 1940s LA feel. Game's set in 1947, right after World War II, and it is detective fiction, so they tried to capture as much of that 1940s detective fiction vibe as they possibly could. The old film noir movies like, say, for instance, The Maltese Falcon. But the thing is, they didn't really capture the feel of film noir. They have elements of it and a lot of themes that were explored in film noir, but it just doesn't feel like film noir. So the title is a little bit misleading in that regard. It still does feel like 1940s detective fiction, though. It just doesn't feel like noir. So that there's a distinction there that you have to keep in mind as you go through this thing. The other thing they did, in addition to making that 1940s LA just come alive and feel just wonderful in that detective idea, was that they made the facial animations absolutely amazing. Why? Because of this technology called motion scan, where it actually scans the actors' faces from every angle as they're performing the roles that they're being. Like, for instance, Aaron Staton for Cole Phelps. And they use this technology to create extremely realistic facial animations that just look great. But even though they had these extremely wonderful facial animations, the rest of the animations in this game are actually kind of clunky. They're a little bit jagged in the movement. They don't have a lot of oomph to them. There's not a lot of weight to them. They just look like... It's just a complete stark contrast between these two things, and it's kind of jarring, actually. So it constantly takes you out of that when you notice these things back and forth. It gets kind of annoying. On top of that, you have issues resulting from it being a console game and from it being a Rockstar game. Rockstar, because it means it's really buggy, and I mean it's a PC version of a console game, so it's going to be extremely buggy to begin with from just the Rockstar point. But so it's got tons of graphics glitches, and it had quite a few of these on console too, so it's not just the PC version, but it has its fair share. And you also have the fact that because it was a console game, the textures are fairly low res for the most part. They didn't pack a massive amount of detail into those, unfortunately. But everything else generally looks pretty good in this game. Then there's the sound design, where you have actors which are going all over the place. Some of them are really, really good. Some of them not so much. They kind of go a little bit over the top on accents. They go kind of cheesy. And that tends to happen more often than not, actually. And that's kind of sad, because they had so much potential with this thing to make it really convincing, and it never really becomes convincing. So that's a little bit depressing. But there is recognizable talent in here. If you've seen some of these actors before, you'll instantly recognize the character because they have the actor's face. So that's just kind of a cool thing. You'll notice and it's like, hey, I know this person. And then at one point it even had Brandon Keener in there. I'm like, wait a minute, this is Brandon Keener. Garrus is in this game. Awesome. So you'll just notice things like that as you go through this thing, and it gives you this interesting vibe to the game. Being able to readily recognize actors and the characters they're playing. It's very cool. But, again, some of them go a little over the top, some of them just kind of cheesy. And then you have the music, which is very fitting for 1940s detective fiction and just 1940s in general. So they really did a great job of capturing the feel of 1940s LA. But does this translate to the gameplay very well? Well, in some ways. One of the ways it does this is by giving you a very authentic detective fiction feel through the use of heavy references to film noir and neo-noir works. For instance, the Black Dahlia is a very prominent thing in this game. And there's a lot of stuff in it that's very heavily based on film noir and neo-noir books and movies and stuff like that. So they tried to capture that feeling as much as possible, but they just didn't capture that film noir feel. They did manage to get the detective stuff down, though. And you play as Cole Phelps in this game. He is a former Marine who was on Okinawa, and he comes back to LA to become a police detective, although he starts out as a beat cop in the game, and that serves as basically your tutorial. And then you go on to the various desks that you'll be a detective in, which are homicide, vice, and arson. And each of these has their own cases and their own overarching storylines, and eventually they all actually tie together. There's also a background storyline that you keep getting through newspapers. Eventually everything comes together at the end. And you also have this backstory of Cole Phelps' time on Okinawa that you constantly get through little snippets of cutscene that just show you what happened. And the problem with that is there are way too many stories all thrown in there at once. I mean, it's one thing to have the story of the case you're working on and the overarching story of that particular desk. That's fine. That was perfectly fine. They did that actually pretty well. It's another thing to have the backstory of Cole Phelps in there, which it didn't bother me as much, but it was still kind of annoying and took me out of the experience quite a bit. And then you have another overarching storyline that ends up tying everything together at the end, and you're just kind of like, wait, what? Because it kind of, at that point, you're like, really, game? You decided to do this? Okay, I guess, whatever. And the problem I had with this thing was, by the end, all of the gameplay mechanics had just lost their steam, and I didn't really care. So the storyline by the end was just kind of a mess. It felt unfinished, actually, and I didn't really feel like it was doing a good job towards the end there. But while you're working on the individual cases, it's pretty good, actually, and they did a very good job of capturing that detective feel. Part of the way they did this was from the gameplay itself. You have to basically play the entire game as an adventure game rather than what you're used to from Rockstar, which is run around and blast everything to pieces. In fact, you pretty much don't get to do that in this game. There are a few segments where you do shooting, and that is not this game's strong point, let me tell you. The aiming just doesn't feel right. The weapons are kind of ridiculously powerful, very easy to take down enemies for the most part, and so you'll never really run into problems on the shooting side of things, and it just feels like it interrupts the game more than anything else, to be honest with you. There are segments where you're doing brawling, and the controls for it are slightly awkward on PC. You had to get used to the way they play out. It's kind of a timing-based minigame where your objective is to just knock the other guy out. And those also just break up the gameplay, and you're like, wait, no, don't want to do this. It's kind of annoying, because that particular minigame is just, it's annoying. You don't really get anything out of it. And then there's, of course, the other stuff in this game. Driving. I hate driving in this game. Why? The cars handle appropriately, which means that they don't have power steering. They handle like big hunks of junk. So it's pretty hard to actually drive around in this game, especially when your frame rate is going all over the place like mine did in this particular game. And before you say, oh, it's your PC, it's not powerful enough, game's just not well optimized at all. So that's the pretty big issue right there. All of this is interfering with the good parts of this game, which are the investigations and the interrogations. That said, the interrogations have their own problems, and the investigations just get a little bit tedious sometimes. It's basically you looking around the crime scenes and such, trying to find clues that you can use in the case, and in particular with interrogations. And then there are the interrogations, where you're interviewing suspects or witnesses and such like that, and you have to determine whether they're telling the truth, you doubt whether they're telling the truth, or they're outright lying, and you give them proof as to why they're lying. And all of these have their own ups and downs. I mean, the investigation stuff is actually pretty interesting because you can see the connections as you're finding clues, and Cole makes comments as he's going along about various things. It gives you an idea of where you need to head next and stuff like that. And then, of course, you have the interrogations themselves, where it's kind of an interesting thing. You become very observational. Problem is, it's pretty blatantly obvious when someone's lying in this game, because their face makes all sorts of ridiculous expressions. Like they'll just sit there and smile goofily at you. Their eyes will wander, their mouth will twitch. They'll just start going all over the place and looking everywhere. It's completely ridiculous. And I think the problem was they were told to act, and they ended up overacting. Now, there are some that do that pretty well, and then there are others that just, you're sitting there like, why did you do this? You're making it painfully easy for me. Especially considering whenever somebody's telling the truth, they literally sit there and just stare at you. They don't move. They don't have any facial alterations at all. They just stare at you. So it's pretty obvious when someone's telling the truth. Thing is, they're almost never telling the truth. So you can just pretty much assume that you're going to be using doubt and lie all the time. The funny thing about these interrogations, though, when you choose doubt, you usually start screaming at them and making very threatening, we'll take you in and charge you with this and this kind of statements at them, and that sort of thing. Whereas when you say that they're lying, you're really just calm and collected, and you're like, oh, you're lying. So there's this really stark contrast in that, and it seems like Cole Phelps he's like a robot almost. He just snaps sometimes and goes off on tirades, and it's like a mental switch or something. It's kind of weird. Yahtzee actually did a pretty good job of describing that. It was kind of funny. But anyway, the other thing you notice is that when you're going around and doing investigations, a lot of the clues are pretty obvious. And the ones that aren't, he'll actually pick up and sit there and you sit there and like, oh, is this a clue? Nope, that's incidental. So they do a good job of throwing in some red herrings in there to make you pay attention to what you're doing. That said, it does get a little bit annoying when there's some obscure clue that you kind of need to walk through to find. And there's one particular puzzle in this game where you had to decipher LA landmarks, and that one was really annoying because I don't know LA very well. I'm not from LA, so it's kind of weird how they managed to do that. That particular puzzle was just irritating. Anyway, the major problem I had with this game, though, was that the interrogation thing and the investigation wear very thin very quickly, because while they do have plenty of it, it takes a really long time. You cannot skip cutscenes, you cannot skip dialogue sequences or anything, but you can skip mini-games. The brawling, the shooting, the driving, you can skip all of that, as provided you fail at it enough. You can skip driving from place to place, which is actually something I love doing because I hate driving in this game. But you can do that, and there's not a lot of replay value in this. I mean, you can go around and do street crimes, but those are very quick things that will just be resolved within a few minutes. Whereas me playing through this whole thing without doing any of these side quests took me about 16 to 18 hours. So there's quite a bit in there, but once you've played through it, you're done. You don't care anymore. You're just done. And so there's almost no replay value in here. And that was kind of the thing that bothered me. Collectibles aren't going to keep you coming back. There's not this real open world feel like you can just go around and do whatever you want to, like in even in GTA and of course stuff like Saints Row. But in this one, you're tied to the fact that you are a policeman, so you can't go off and do all sorts of ridiculous things. You're pretty much tied to doing the various cases, so that severely limits the replay value of this game. And I have a really hard time recommending it because it's one of those things you're either going to like it or you're not going to like it. And being a fan of adventure games, I kind of digged it for a while, but it really wore thin very quickly, especially considering that it just doesn't run very well on PC. So if you're going to try this out, definitely try the console version. It will run infinitely better. But that's kind of the problem. I mean, the PC version's inferior. It has lots of bugs, but it's still, you're going to want to try this thing before you go and fully commit to buying it, because otherwise you're probably going to be put off by the fact that this is not like anything Rockstar has ever done before, and it's just a completely different vibe altogether. It's an interesting game, and it's certainly very interesting due to its technology, but the gameplay leaves a lot to be desired. That's why I give it a 2 out of 5. Thanks for watching.